Hey everybody, this is John the Other. Now, normally I wouldn't be doing another video until next weekend, but I was made aware of statements made by my Prime Minister that I thought I should probably respond to as quickly as I can, so here we go. We're doing another video, and it's Sunday. On November 25th, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, issued the following statements to commemorate what is called Holodomor Memorial Day. That is the name for a genocide of about 11 million Ukrainian farmers and peasants. This was accomplished by expelling them from their land, directly murdering a large number of them, and by mass starvation. Now, this is going to be a really cheerful and upbeat video, so, if you're feeling down, this is exactly the video for you. I learned of this speech a week after Trudeau made it, because one of my friends mentioned it to me. Now, they had stated their surprise and pleasure that Prime Minister Zoolander had the depth of character to remark on one of Marxism's many genocides of the 20th century. And they also said they were glad that he did not make light of this genocide. But I think he did. Here's what Trudeau said. Quote, "Today we commemorate one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Ukrainian Holodomor of 1932-33. This systematic and horrific genocide undertaken by a totalitarian Soviet regime killed millions of Ukrainian men, women, and children by starvation. It was a failed attempt to destroy the identity and the will of the Ukrainian people." But that is not correct. That is not a realistic summary of the genocide of about 11 million Ukrainian peasants and farmers. What did the Prime Minister say? Undertaken by a totalitarian Soviet regime. No, wrong. And there's no excuse for Canada's Prime Minister getting this one as wrong as this. Okay, there is an excuse. We're playing the blame the Russians game. I know this is kind of old news, but maybe somebody could let our Prime Minister know that Hillary lost and it wasn't the Russians. Now, it's true that in December 1929, Joseph Stalin used the state-run newspaper to announce the, quote, liquidation of the kulak class. Kulaks was the name of the Ukrainian peasant class who had become the most productive farmers in the region over a period of many decades. As a consequence, the kulaks had begun to have a higher standard of living than other peasants in the Ukraine in the early 20th century. But differences in skill level cannot exist if you actually believe in literal equality. So, obviously, competent farmers can't exist, so you have to see them as criminals instead. But the murder of these farmers didn't just happen isolated in 1932 and 33. It didn't even begin in 1929 when Stalin announced they'd be liquidated. If you're going to subjugate or expel the most productive members of your society, you've got to begin to build a populist narrative against them for at least a decade first. And fortunately for us, nothing like that is happening here yet. But the de-kulakization of Ukraine began with an economic theory which informed the Marxist Russian Labor Party. In this doctrine, economic differences are always due to unfair exploitation. There is no such thing as a more skilled farmer. Any success by any person must be treated as an offense against decent behavior and punished accordingly. Incidentally, the non-existence of competence in Marxist theory goes some long way to explaining its popularity among campus postmodernists. But the present-day term for this so-called abusive exploitation is privilege. Now, if that seems like an excessively simplistic and stupidly one-dimensional way to understand a world full of complexity, well, congratulations, you're probably not a Marxist or a postmodernist. Which is to say, you need to go educate yourself, you cis-heteropatriarchal white supremacist oppressor. But within Marxism and its postmodernism 2.0 version, there is only power. Communication is only a tool to exploit and subjugate people. That's how we get to the typical campus rhetoric that free speech is the same thing as violence. And yes, this is a very stupid, narrow, and unproductive way to look at anything as complex as human society. But that is the viewpoint informing the October Revolution, and the purpose was to make everybody equal to one another. In 1917, it was very clear that kulaks were economically unequal to the other peasants, and in a perfectly reasonable postmodernist logic, the answer to this equality was to murder those farmers, steal their land, and ship the survivors off to Siberia, where they could starve to death without driving the local property values down. This is how a political and economic philosophy built from jealousy and resentment addresses economic inequality. murder the people with the most and steal their stuff. That's how the Russian Marxists did it. That's how the Cuban Marxist did it under Justin's uncle Fidel. That's how the Cambodian communists did it under Pol Pot, and that's how the Chinese communists did it under Mao. Kill anyone who has a little bit more, steal their stuff. That's how you get true equality. In terms of numbers, the kulaks who were murdered were somewhere between 700,000 and 5 million people killed. That's not just a really big percentage difference, that's an order of magnitude. So many people were murdered that we don't have any closer detail on the number than having that range between hundreds of thousands and millions. The larger number of deaths came after, when there were no productive farmers left in Ukraine and millions of the peasants died of starvation. I'll repeat that so you can get a sense of the scale. In 1932 and 33, the estimate is that somewhere between 2 million and 12 million Ukrainians starved to death. It was death of such a scale that nobody today can figure out the number with any finer accuracy than that very, very broad range. But getting back to Justin Trudeau, he calls this a systematic and horrific genocide perpetrated by the totalitarian Soviet regime. Yes, it was a systematic and horrific genocide, that much is true, but the purpose was to make them equal. And to a degree, it succeeded in the sense of making somewhere between 2 and 12 million equally dead. And again, the driver of this, the ideology which articulates resentment and jealousy as murder and theft with a 100% reliability rate in every single society that it has ever been tried in. And I guess this does explain why Justin Trudeau, with his Marxist daddy and his uncomfortably close family ties to communist dictator Fidel Castro, was so cagey in naming the cause of that 2 to 12 million murdered Ukrainians. The label totalitarian Soviet regime does not strike so close to home as the Marxist philosophy that his dad believed in, and that's whether you think Dad was the French-Canadian Marxist former Prime Minister, or if you think his dad's name was Fidel, and the Cuban communist dictator was more than just a close friend of the family. And as close to home as each of these possibilities are, it's also probably pretty uncomfortable to spot the fact that Marxism, with a shiny new name, is now the ideology being fed to students, and paid for by your taxes, in every Canadian campus with a social justice agenda. You know, the campus doctrine that puts equity and equality above all other values. It would be uncomfortable for the son of Margaret Trudeau to talk about Marxism as the cause of a genocide, while the government that he's the Prime Minister of funds Marxism on the campus. So I understand the choice to call it only a totalitarian Soviet regime, but calling it that is still a lie, and Hillary also didn't lose because of the Russians either. But Trudeau has a few other words of wisdom for us. He says, "We stand with the victims of the Holodomor," that's the genocide, "and their descendants, to remember and condemn this unconscionable act. Remembering history is our best hope against repeating it." Oh, Lordy. Well, that last part is true. Remembering history is the best, and it's possibly the only way to avoid repeating it. But it's also a cliche. So I wonder if our very foolish Prime Minister understands what he is repeating, or is he just flapping his mouth in time with the words? And I ask this because the remembrance given by Prime Minister Zoolander diverts attention away from the cause of that mass murder. That's of course the ideology of forced equality between people that in the current year we describe with the warm and fuzzy term equity. Pay no attention to that. Nope. And blame the Russians isn't even a novel lie. It's the same feeble excuse used by CNN, by Hillary, by Theresa May, by George Takei. Oh my. But we do want to avoid repeating the Marxist genocides that peppered the 20th century. Don't we? So why is my government funding this ideology's promotion in our schools and university and lying about the cause of a genocide on the day of its remembrance? I don't actually think Justin Trudeau is evil. I think he's stupid in a way that only a very, very rich and pampered man-child is capable of being stupid. Somebody who has his entire life been insulated from the direct consequences of his never-corrected childish innocence. He is, in my opinion, a perfectly harmless, happy little man. But when that harmless and innocent creature sits at the very top of a nation's highest hierarchy, then there is really no practical difference at all between being stupid and being evil, except that evil might be preferable as long as it was accompanied by competence, which in this case it is evidently not. And Trudeau's little speech continues. He says, on this somber anniversary, I invite all Canadians to take time today to remember the victims of the Holodomor and to reflect on the remarkable contributions citizens of the Ukraine have made to our country. Okay. Remember the victims and reflect on the remarkable contributions that citizens of Ukrainian descent have made to Canada. I think nothing could be more empty and useless than this. So I suggest an alternative. How about, rather than displaying a false piety with our fatuous posturing of remembrance of victims, none of whom you can remember because it happened 90 years ago on a different continent, how about instead we remember the ideology that created the Ukrainian genocide, and remember that this ideology caused in Ukraine between 2 and 12 million deaths by starvation and murder, and worldwide between 60 and 100 million deaths by starvation and murder around the world, and we rightly regard this as a murderous and genocidal ideology and try as hard as we can not to allow it to channel humanity's most destructive tendencies into ascendancy again in governing human affairs. Maybe that would be a better and more useful way to remember this particular genocide. Mr. Trudeau, you dangerously incompetent man-child who we elected shamefully because I guess you're pretty. So, thanks to everybody who's begun to support this channel through Patreon. There's a link to that in the low bar. Thanks to everybody else for listening and subscribing, and as always, have a lovely day. And I promise the next video after this will be less depressing.